On the 3rd of March 2011, in a tiny restaurant in Paris, a business dinner was taking place involving 3 key personnel. These 3 personnel being then FIA President Jean Todt and 2 politicians, which were Antonio Tajani, who nowadays is the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, and a Spanish politician and businessman by the name of Alejandro Agag. The dinner was organised by Jean Todt himself, as he had planned to conceptualise a brand new single-seater championship that would be powered by electricity. After sharing ideas back and forth, with Jean infamously jotting these ideas down on the back of one of the restaurant's handkerchiefs, Tajani was given the task to concentrate solely on assisting the automotive industry in going electric, whilst Agag, who had experience of being a persuasive negotiator, was essentially tasked with being the series promoter, a little bit like Bernie Ecclestone in Formula 1, only less out of touch. The series would be revealed to the public later on in the year, and that series would become known as Formula E. This is the story of its first ever season. On the 10th of September 2013, the first ever Formula E car was launched to the world at the Frankfurt Motor Show, after only 10 months of development, following a period of demonstration and promotional work using the Formula E EF01 that was built in 2010 and purchased by Formula E in 2012. The first Formula E car would be known as the Spark Renault SRT01E, and as you might have guessed from the name, it was designed by Spark Racing Technology, which was found by current Ferrari team principal Frédéric Vasseur in collaboration with Dallara, and would be powered by a Renault powertrain, which every team on the grid would use in order to make it a level playing field for the first season. The car would be fitted with a 5-speed gearbox, an electronic motor that was produced by McLaren, and a 28 kilowatt lithium-ion battery that was produced by Williams. The Renault powertrain would consist of 200 kilowatts, which would be restricted to 150 whenever the car was on power saving mode, and it would be given an extra 30 kilowatts for the push-to-pass system, known as Fan Boost, a system where fans would vote for their favourite driver before the race, where the 3 drivers who got the most votes were given an extra 30 kilowatts for the first stint of the race and also after their mandatory pit stop. Personally, looking back, this was a stupid system, which often led to favouritism with certain drivers, and was thankfully scrapped after the conclusion of the 2021-22 season. 10 teams would take part in the first ever season of Formula E, which you can see on your screen right now. However, Drayson Racing would end up pulling out before the season began, allowing Trulli Grand Prix, owned by Jarno Trulli, to enter his own team instead, although Drayson would still continue to offer technical support to them. The season would initially consist of 11 meetings, but was reduced to 10, following the cancellation of both the Hong Kong and Rio de Janeiro E-Prix, with Moscow coming in as a late replacement, whilst the finale in London would become a double header to bump it back up to 11 rounds. A little bit similar to football, the seasons would start at the back end of a year and finish towards the end of the first half of the following year, something the series hasn't done since the pandemic, but seems to be slowly getting back into the habit of for the upcoming season. The series would adopt the same top 10 point system Formula 1 uses, but award bonus points for qualifying in the fastest lap, with the quickest driver in qualifying getting 3 points and the driver who set the fastest lap during the race receiving 2 points. The series would also adopt a similar system to what Formula 1 had in the late 80s, and also what the BTCC had during the back end of the Super Touring era, which was where a driver's lowest point scoring round would be dropped from their final points total. Thankfully, this was scrapped after 1 season, as like with the other series mentioned, it was a stupid idea. Pre-season testing would take place at Donington Park, as per an agreement with the circuit to in-house all 10 Formula E teams until they all found their own headquarters at the conclusion of Season 3. During pre-season testing, it was very clear that despite every team having the same car, EDAMs looked to be very quick, with Sebastian Buemi being towards the sharp end of the timing screens on most days. But whether they could transfer this pace into the first race or not remained to be seen. After 2 years of preparation, it was time for the 2014-15 Formula E season to get underway, so let's see how that season panned out. The first race of the brand new championship would take place on the 13th of September, just over a year after the first Formula E car was revealed to the world. The race would take place on a street circuit known as the Beijing Olympic Green Circuit, which would be located right next to the stadium that hosted the 2008 Summer Olympics. And that would be the premise for the series going forward. No, not being next to a stadium, I mean the races being on street circuits. With the idea of the series to promote electric cars to the world, it was felt the best way to do this would be for the series to have all its races on street courses, some of which cobbled together for the purpose of Formula E, others which already existed, such as Punta del Este in Uruguay, Long Beach in California, and of course the Circuit de Monaco, home of the Monaco Grand Prix, although the last two I mentioned would take place on shorter variants of those circuits. During qualifying, Edams would take the first pole of the season, but it wouldn't come courtesy of Sebastian Buemi, as he found himself down in a dismal 9th, which later became 18th, after he, along with 4 other drivers, changed their gearbox before the race. Instead, it would be his teammate Nicolas Prost, son of 4-time Formula 1 world champion Alain, who would take the first ever Formula E pole, followed by the 2 Audi Abt cars of Lucas di Grassi and Daniel Abt. Prost was able to fend off the 2 Abts at the start, whilst Nick Heidfeld in the Venturi was able to get a lightning start to move up to 4th, getting around Karun Chandik's Mahindra. Going into turn 2, and Chandik's teammate Bruno Senna, who ironically was his teammate in both GP2 and Formula 1, would end his race early, after damaging his front right suspension following a collision with the inside sausage curb whilst trying to avoid the Amelin Aguri of Takuma Sato, who was substituting for Antonio Felix da Costa, who had commitments in DTM. Apart from Buemi having his rear wing loose and Heidfeld jumping the 2 Abt cars during the mandatory pit stop, where drivers were required to swap cars due to the short range the batteries had at the time, the race ended up being a quiet one, with Prost controlling things up front. That was until the closing stages of the race, where Heidfeld would start to get the hammer down and close in on Prost. Going on to the final lap of the race, Heidfeld was tucked up behind Prost, heading down towards the final corner. And it was at this point where one of the most viral moments in Formula E history was about to take place. Feels like I've used this clip once before on this channel. Going into the final corner, Heidfeld got a good run on Prost to go down the inside of the Frenchman at the final corner. Whilst alongside, Prost defended way too late and swerved into the side of Heidfeld, causing damage to Nick's suspension, leading him to lose control of the car and launch off the inside sausage curb, barrel rolling a few times in the air on impact with the tyre barrier before coming to a rest upside down. Nick was thankfully okay and was able to climb out of the car with no injuries, a testament to the safety of the new Formula E car. Prost's race was also over, as he too broke his suspension in the process, allowing the Abt of Lucas di Grassi to take the first win in Formula E, followed home by the Andretti of Frank Montagny and the Virgin Racing car of Sam Bird. It almost felt fitting that the man who was hired as the series test driver and doing promotional work for nearly 2 years would end up taking the first win of the series, with Lucas himself showing his excitement on the podium, even if it was by a lot of luck. The crash would put the series on the worldwide map and would make more people tune in for the next race, although they would have to wait as round 2 would take place 2 months later. But it would be worth the wait, as the crash from Beijing seemed to spark a rippled effect, not in terms of crashes, but in overall excitement for the rest of the season. At Putrajaya in Malaysia, Nico Prost would once again be the quickest in qualifying, but he would not start from pole, as he was forced to take a 10th-place grid penalty as a direct result of the accident he caused with Nick Heidfeld at Beijing, but would keep the 3 points for setting the fastest time. He wouldn't be the only E-Downs with it all to do, as teammate Buemi was forced to start from the back after he was disqualified from qualifying due to his car being underweight. He would be joined on the back row by the Dragon Racing of Jerome D'Ambrosio, as he too was disqualified from qualifying, not because his car was underweight, but because he exceeded his power usage during his qualifying runs. Instead, it would be Jerome's teammate Oriol Silvia who would assume pole position. However, he wouldn't convert the pole into the win, as after getting a poor reaction from the safety car restart, Silvia would lose the lead at turn 1 and would start to tumble down the order. Instead, it would be the Virgin racing car of Sam Bird who would come through to become the second ever Formula E winner, winning by just over 4 seconds ahead of Lucas Di Grassi, who would keep the lead in the championship, and Sebastian Buemi, who would make a brilliant recovery drive and avoid any chaos in front of him to grab the final podium spot ahead of teammate Nico Prost. Buemi would continue this momentum at the next race at Punta del Este, as after getting the jump on teammate Nico Prost at the start, Buemi would pressure the top 2 of Nelson Piquet Jr. and the debuting Jean-Eric Vergne, who was replacing Frank Montagny for the rest of the season as a result of Frank failing a drugs test. After Piquet was forced to let Buemi through after cutting the first chicane, Buemi was able to get the jump on Vergne during the mandatory pit stops as a result of Vergne getting screwed over by the safety car to grab his first ever Formula E win, followed home by Nelson Piquet Jr., who after being invisible in the first 2 races would grab his first podium of the season, whilst Lucas Di Grassi made it 3 out of 3 podiums in 3rd, ensuring he still maintained a healthy lead in the Drivers' Championship. However, at the next race in Buenos Aires, Di Grassi's lead would be cut down, as whilst leading the race, his rear left suspension would collapse at the last chicane, forcing him to retire from the race. He wouldn't be the only one to damage his suspension at that chicane, as 3 laps prior, Sebastian Buemi, who was also leading the race, would clip the inside wall, damaging his front right suspension and also being forced to retire. This in turn led to Antonio Felix da Costa to grab his first ever Formula E win in the Amlin Aguri, whilst Nicolas Prost and Nelson Piquet Jr. would join him on the podium following a collision on the penultimate lap involving Sam Bird and Daniel Abt. Bird would finish in 7th as a result, but would gain points on Di Grassi in the standings, cutting the gap down to 10 points as a result of picking up the fastest lap points. The next 2 races would take place in America, with Miami being the first to host, with the circuit using sections that were previously used for the Museum Park circuit in kart. This race would see Jean-Eric Vergne grab pole position yet again, but would once again not convert the pole, as after getting jumped in the pits, he would retire towards the end of the race due to suffering damage from a collision unseen by the cameras. Bird would also end up having some bad luck, as after initially grabbing the lead from Vergne before the mandatory pit stops, he would finish down in 8th, having had to crawl back to the pits for his mandatory car swap due to being low on energy. Instead, after much bad luck during the season, it would be Nico Prost who would take his first win of the season after a close fight with the Andretti of Scott Speed, who was making his Formula E debut in that race. Yeah, it should be worth pointing out that there were a lot of driver changes during the first season, so much so that at times it was hard to keep up. Nico's win was quite significant, as thanks to Di Grassi finishing down in 7th, he now led the Drivers' Championship by 7 points. But this wouldn't last too long, as at the next race at Long Beach, Di Grassi would regain the lead in the standings, as despite Nico getting 2 points for the fastest lap, he would finish down in 14th after having to serve a drive-through penalty due to a collision with Jerome D'Ambrosio. Although Di Grassi would regain the lead in the standings, he wouldn't win the race, as his fellow compatriot Nelson Piquet Jr. would make it 6 different winners in 6 races, and with Jean-Eric Vergne finishing in between both himself and Di Grassi, and with the level of consistency Piquet showed in the previous races, he now shot himself in contention for the title, being 1 point behind Di Grassi in 2nd. The pair would be joined by another contender after Monaco, as after a commanding drive from pole position, Sebastian Buemi would become the first double winner of the season, putting himself 10 points behind championship leader Di Grassi, who finished behind him in second ahead of Nelson Piquet. Then, at the next race in Berlin, the championship would take a huge twist. After jumping Jarno Trulli at the start, Di Grassi, after a dominant drive, would come through to take his second win of the season. However, the celebrations were shortened, as Di Grassi would end up getting disqualified from the race after it was discovered that his Audi Abt was using parts that were not standard, and therefore not in compliance with the regulations. This promoted Jerome D'Ambrosio as the winner, with Buemi assuming second and Piquet moving up to fourth. This meant that rather than Di Grassi increasing his lead in the standings, he would instead drop to third behind Buemi and Piquet, with Piquet becoming the new championship leader by 2 points. Then Piquet would increase his lead even further at the penultimate meeting in Moscow, as after jumping Jean-Eric Vergne at the start, who once again was unable to convert the pole, Piquet would come through to take his second win of the season, finishing 2 seconds ahead of Di Grassi, whilst Buemi, who initially finished third, was classified down in 9th after receiving a drive-through penalty, which would be converted into a 29-second penalty for an unsafe release after his car swap. This meant that going into the final meeting, which was a double-header, Piquet led the standings by 17 points ahead of Di Grassi and a further 6 points ahead of Buemi. After an exciting season, the title was going down to the final meeting, and no one had a clue who would come out on top. The final meeting of the season would take place at Battersea Park in London, making it the first time since 1972 that London would host a motor racing event, with the last event being held at the now defunct Crystal Palace, not to be confused with the football club that plays at Selhurst Park. It would mark the first time in the series' history that a Formula E event would host 2 races, something that would become quite common in future seasons. But there would be something that would be quite memorable for the Battersea Park Street Circuit for all the wrong reasons. During practice, there were huge concerns raised about a massive bump at the first corner, with the drivers being briefly up in the air whilst riding over it. These concerns would come to a head when the Venturi of Jerome D'Ambrosio would hit the bump at such an angle that his rear right suspension would collapse, bringing an end to his session. The bump would also cause damage to 3 of the car's underfloor planks, and with the concerns raised about the safety of that corner, the decision was taken to put a barrier on the inside, whilst repairs would be done after the race to ensure it wouldn't be a problem for race 2. This meant, as a result, that race 1 would start behind the safety car, as a result of the temporary inside barrier, effectively making the first corner 1 lane. This wouldn't be a problem for Buemi, as with him needing to grab a huge amount of points in race 1 to have any chance of winning the title, he would do just that, by grabbing pole for race 1 and then converting the pole into the win after a commanding drive. Di Grassi and Piquet, after an intense fight throughout the race, would finish down in 4th and 5th respectively after the pair of them got overtaken by Vergne, meaning going into the final race, Piquet only led the championship by 5 points ahead of Buemi, who moved up to 2nd thanks to his win in race 1. Di Grassi meanwhile was a further 8 points behind in 3rd, and with him being 13 points back, he would need a miracle to win the title. Race 2 would see the first corner opened up again thanks to repair works that were done overnight to smoothen the surface, but this change wouldn't help both Di Grassi and Piquet in qualifying, as both of them had a dreadful session thanks to the changeable conditions, with Di Grassi finishing down in 11th whilst Piquet was all the way down in 16th. And with Buemi all the way up in 6th, it looked to be in Buemi's hands, but like with anything in motorsport, anything could happen, and if either Piquet or Di Grassi wanted to become the first ever Formula E champion, they would need to climb their way through the order. But with the narrow nature of Battersea Park, that was not going to be easy. At the start, Stefan Sarrazin, who started from pole, would hold on to the lead ahead of Loic Duval, whilst behind, Buemi would gain a place at the start to move up to 5th. Degrassi and Piquet were also able to gain places at the start, with Degrassi moving up to 9th, whilst Piquet was the biggest gainer, moving up to 12th. The pack would stay line astern until lap 7, when Sakon Yamamoto would crash out of the race after misjudging his braking at turn 3, careering into the back of Jarno Trulli, who was lucky to keep going. Despite this though, the safety car was not brought out, and because it happened behind, neither Degrassi or Piquet were able to gain places, meaning that Buemi was still in prime position to take the title. They would gain another place eventually on the following lap after Nick Heidfeld came into the pit and crawled to a halt thanks to a mechanical issue, but they were still not in a position to win the title. Then on lap 13, Piquet would be gifted another place, which in turn moved him up into the points after Jean-Eric Vergne was handed a drive-through penalty for maximum overuse on power. Then came the mandatory car swap, with Degrassi being the first of the title contenders to blink at the end of lap 14, and he would get the jump on Salvador Duran after being stuck behind him for many laps. Buemi would be the next of the title contenders to do their mandatory car swap, whilst Piquet stayed out to temporarily take the lead as a result of him still having quite a bit of energy left thanks to him preserving for many laps. Buemi would maintain position after his mandatory stop. However, going into turn 3, and after just coming out of the pit, Buemi would lose the back end and spin, losing a place to the Mahindra of Bruno Senna and putting himself into the clutches of Lucas Degrassi, who himself nearly lost the rear end at the approach to turn 8. Whilst that was happening, Nelson Piquet finally came in for his mandatory car swap and would rejoin once again behind teammate Oliver Turvey in P10, just getting out in front of Nico Prost, even whilst also nearly making a similar error at turn 3 to Buemi. But even with Buemi's error from earlier, Sebastian was still in a position to win the title, and Piquet needed to gain a couple of more places to swing the championship in his favour. And luckily for Piquet, who was quite a bit behind his teammate Turvey, he would get a chance to catch back up, as the safety car was brought out on lap 20 due to Fabio Lima, who was replacing the ill Jaime Alguersuari, binning his car into the barriers at the turns 11-12 chicane. It would only take a lap though before the safety car was brought in, but even so, Piquet was now behind his teammate again, with the pair trying everything they could to get past Salvador Duran. Then on lap 23, and with only 6 and a bit laps to go, Turvey would let Piquet through to try and attack Duran, and not wasting any time, Piquet would make the move on Duran at the bus stop chicane to move up into 8th place. This meant that with Buemi stuck behind Senna in 6th, Piquet was now in a position to win the title. Buemi needed to get past Senna to get back into a championship winning position, but Bruno was not going to make things easy. Buemi tried everything to get past, even making contact with Senna on a few occasions, but the Brazilian wouldn't budge. Elsewhere in front, Stefan Sarrazin and Sam Bird were into combat for the win, with Bird even tapping the back of Sarrazin into the bus stop chicane. However, on the final lap, Sarrazin's chance of winning the race would be in tatters, as he would run out of energy before reaching the checkered flag, which in turn would give him a drive-through penalty that would be converted to a 49-second penalty, dropping him out of the points and handing Bird the win. This late drama would not affect the outcome of the championship, as despite Buemi's best efforts on the last lap, he couldn't find a way past Senna, much to his frustration on the cool-down lap, meaning as a result of finishing 7th, Nelson Piquet Jr. became the first ever Formula E champion. After starting all the way down in 16th due to changeable conditions, Piquet was able to get the lightning start he needed, and biding his time, he would perform a champion's drive to win that title, and the emotions that Nelson showed whilst talking to the Formula E commentators was amazing to see, given it had been just over a decade since he last won a title in any category, and it was the redemption he needed after the Crashgate saga that he was in the middle of in 2008. Although he won the driver's title, his team Next TV China Racing were not able to win the first ever team's title, as despite not being able to overtake Senna, Buemi and Prost did enough to ensure Renault Edams became the first ever team's champions, winning the title in race 1 and would go on to retain that title for the next 2 seasons. Buemi would get his redemption the following season by winning the title off Lucas Di Grassi in one of the most bizarre title battles I've ever seen, and I have made a video on that in the past if you are interested. Di Grassi would win the title the following season off Buemi as a result of the Swiss driver having to miss the New York meeting due to commitments in WEC with Toyota. Since then though, neither of the title contenders from the first ever season have won another title since, with Piquet leaving the series after the first season of the Gen 2 era. Nevertheless, the first ever season is looked fondly as an amazing first season for Formula E and a great advertisement for the series as a whole, and personally speaking, it is probably my favourite season of Formula E, as although there have been some good seasons since then, I don't think they've ever topped the first season. The 2014-15 Formula E season, an amazing debut season for a championship that is still going strong to this very day.